It became the most humiliating radio transmission of the Vietnam War. But before reaching that moment, we have to go back to where the embarrassment truly began. Start in a garage, March 1968. A newly built airstrip in South Vietnam, a seasoned U.S. Green Beret captain stood, watching something that made no sense to him. On the tarmac, Australian SAS soldiers were using hacksaws on their rifles. This was not repair work. It was intentional destruction of precision weapons. A captain laughed and turned to his men, saying, "Look at those idiots. They will not last a week." He could not have been more wrong, because 6 hours later, he was no longer laughing. That same captain was trapped in a jungle ambush, encircled by Viet Cong forces, shouting into his radio for rescue, and the only troops coming to save him were the same men he had mocked, the Australians with the shortened weapons. What followed did more than keep him alive. It exposed the weakness of American doctrine and eventually forced the Pentagon to rewrite its manuals, to understand why we need to meet the first man who realized what the Australians were really doing. March 14th, 1968. An American intelligence officer stepped off a Huey helicopter at the Australian base at Nui Dat. As soon as his boots hit the ground, he covered his nose. The smell was intense, layered, and aggressive. It suggested decay, stagnant water, and prolonged human neglect. This officer had spent a year and a half in Vietnam. He had seen field hospitals, burned villages, and mass graves. None of that prepared him for what was coming from Australian soldiers standing only 40 meters away. Approached an Australian lieutenant, intending to offer hygiene supplies. The response he received stayed with him for decades. The smell was not negligence, it was doctrine, and it explained why Australian soldiers returned home alive, while many Americans returned in metal coffins. The American officer demanded an explanation. What he received overturned everything he thought he knew about jungle warfare, and the smell was only the first surprise. Next were the weapons. Something was clearly off. The rifle barrels were far too short. Someone had deliberately cut down L1A1 rifles, among the best battle rifles ever made. This was not damage, it was modification. And there was the footwear. Australian soldiers were wearing sandals made from vehicle tires. The officer recognized them immediately. Ho Chi Minh sandals, standard Viet Cong gear. Why were Allied troops wearing enemy equipment? Then there was language. Americans used slurs and nicknames for the enemy. The Australians referred to them as Mr. Charles with genuine respect, not irony. The intelligence officer spent 3 days documenting everything. He wrote a detailed report, urging American forces to adopt Australian methods. The report was classified and buried. The Pentagon did not want evidence suggesting American doctrine was flawed. 6 days later, a jungle delivered a lesson that could not be hidden. American doctrine would fail so badly that denial was no longer possible. And the Green Beret captain who had laughed was about to learn why mocking men who understand survival is a mistake before following him into the jungle disaster. We need to understand what the Australians had figured out, because the numbers told a story the Pentagon tried to suppress. Australian SAS patrols in Phuoc Thu province achieved kill ratios of roughly 1 friendly loss for every 500 enemy eliminated. 1 to 500 American units running the same missions nearby averaged 1 to 12. This was not a small difference. It was devastating. Start with what offended Americans the most. The smell. Soldiers were issued hygiene kits with soap, deodorant, shaving cream, toothpaste, and insect repellent. Cleanliness was seen as essential for discipline and morale. The Viet Cong learned to exploit this. Captured fighters repeatedly confirmed that American patrols could be smelled from over 500 meters away. Deodorant left trails that lasted hours. Insect repellent carried even farther. Cigarettes revealed positions from nearly a kilometer. The Australians removed every marker 2 weeks before a patrol. SAS troops stopped using soap entirely. They abandoned deodorant, shaving cream, and toothpaste. They ate local food, including fermented fish sauce, that altered body chemistry. By insertion day, they smelled like the jungle itself. Viet Cong patrols regularly passed within 2 meters of concealed Australians without noticing anything. In one confirmed case from November 1967, an enemy fighter stepped directly on an Australian. Boot looked down, saw only jungle debris, and walked on the trooper. Never moved smell control was only the first layer. Then came the altered rifles. The Australians shortened the L1A1 cutting barrels, and removing flash suppressors, effective range dropped by more than half. They called the modified weapon the same name every soldier knew, and it was designed for jungle reality. In dense Vietnamese jungle, visibility averaged 10 to 15 meters. A rifle accurate at 400 meters was pointless. Worse, the long barrel caught vines and bamboo. Every snag caused noise. Noise meant detection. The shortened rifle slid through vegetation easily. Its 7.62mm round delivered immediate stopping power. At close range, the American M16 with 5.56 ammunition often wounded instead of stopping. Fighters sometimes continued forward for seconds after being mortally hit. The Australian round did not wound. It ended the fight instantly. American ordnance officers wrote critical reports recommending adoption of Australian methods. Those reports were filed and ignored. Movement doctrine was next. Americans initially thought there was confusion when Australians described patrol speeds of 100 to 200 meters per hour. At that pace, a kilometer could take most of a day. A 5-kilometer patrol might take nearly a week. By American standards, this seemed absurd. The Australians offered a demonstration. 4 SAS troopers entered jungle 500 meters from the Nui Dat perimeter. The lead man chose ground that would support weight without disturbing leaves. He took one step, then the patrol froze for 4 minutes. No posture shifts, no gear adjustment. Head stayed still. Only eyes moved. Breathing was controlled, so the chest did not rise. The jungle returned to normal. Insects resumed. Birds continued calling. After 4 minutes, they took another step. In 30 minutes, they moved 50 meters. American officer observing from 15 meters away reported hearing nothing, no vegetation movement, no footfalls, no sound changes. The logic was simple. American patrols moving 2 to 3 kilometers a day created constant disturbance. Broken branches, crushed plants, displaced insects, altered wildlife. Viet Cong listening posts were trained to recognize these patterns at Australian movement rates. The jungle fully reset between steps. Nothing accumulated. Nothing appeared unusual as a result. Australian patrols detected enemy movement hours before being detected themselves. Listening became as important as seeing. They were not unseen because they hid. They were unseen because they did not register as presence. This required patience, time, and training, not technology. By American doctrine, it looked inefficient. In jungle reality, it was decisive. 6 days after the intelligence officer finished his observations, U.S. forces launched a routine mission nearby. The task went to the 173rd Airborne Brigade, a company of 118 paratroopers, led by a West Point-trained captain on his second tour. He was decorated, competent, and aggressive. The unit followed standard doctrine: helicopter insertion, normal movement speed, regulation equipment, and hygiene. They did not know an Australian SAS patrol of 4 men, led by a veteran sergeant, had been in the area for 6 days. That patrol had already identified a Viet Cong battalion headquarters and was monitoring it. The information went through Australian channels and never reached the American company. As the U.S. unit advanced, Viet Cong listening posts detected it from over 300 meters away. Noise, scent, and movement matched known patterns. The enemy commander had half an hour to prepare. At 11:47, the ambush began. An L-shaped kill zone, automatic weapons, and rocket grenades from multiple directions. 23 Americans were hit in the first 20 seconds. The company commander survived because he was near the center, not the front. He executed doctrine suppressive fire artillery requests, helicopter gunships perimeter defense artillery. Landed within 8 minutes, gunships arrived soon after. None of it changed the fight. The Viet Cong were in fortified camouflaged positions, built over weeks. Artillery could not reach them. Gunships could not see them. The Americans saw nothing. The enemy saw everything. By 12:30, more than 40 Americans were casualties. Ammunition was running low. Supporting fires had achieved no confirmed effect. The commander realized his unit was being dismantled by an unseen enemy. At 12:51, he made a request. Outside normal channels, he asked for help from the Australian SAS patrol. He had previously declined to coordinate with the Australian sergeant. Immediately understood Allied troops were engaged less than 2 kilometers away and losing men standard. Doctrine discouraged intervention. 4 men against a reinforced battalion was not considered survivable. He chose to move anyway. When the American commander was told the Australians were advancing at 100 meters per hour, he protested. Casualties were ongoing. He demanded faster movement. The sergeant refused. He explained that speed would cause detection, and detection would increase casualties without changing the outcome. For 93 minutes, the American unit held under fire. During that time, the Australians were not approaching the American line. They were moving through the enemy, using the battle noise as cover and strict scent discipline they slipped into. A Viet Cong rear passing within meters of fighters focused elsewhere. They made no contact. At 14:27. The patrol reached a position inside the enemy perimeter 35 meters from the command post. From there, the sergeant began transmitting precise artillery corrections. The first strike eliminated the command element. Follow-on corrections destroyed weapon positions, sealed escape routes, and detonated an ammunition cache. Within 18 minutes, the fight reversed. The enemy disengaged Americans, consolidated, and prepared extraction. The Australians suffered 0 casualties. Radio call that began this chain was classified not for security, but because it proved established doctrine had failed where alternative methods succeeded. The battle was not treated as an isolated event. After-action reports were classified because their implications were uncomfortable. 4 men using non-standard methods had altered a battle that numbers, firepower, and doctrine could not control. Later, in 1968, captured Viet Cong documents confirmed this was not unusual. Enemy manuals distinguished clearly between Australian and American forces. Against Americans, they exploited predictability, helicopter insertions, loud and visible patrols, leaving landing zones along expected routes, listening posts positioned along likely paths, ambushes, prepared to inflict maximum casualties immediately, then withdraw before artillery and air support could respond. Guidance for dealing with Australians was entirely different. Enemy units reported scent detection was unreliable, movement noise was intermittent or absent, tracks were unclear, routes were unpredictable. Australians crossed streams, reversed direction, paused for hours in terrain that seemed meaningless. Ambush planning was often compromised when patrols halted or changed direction unexpectedly. Enemy forces were instructed to avoid contact with Australian patrols unless overwhelming advantage existed. Pursuit was discouraged. Counter-ambush risk was high. If contact occurred, disengagement was advised. This shift changed enemy behavior. In Australian areas, movements became cautious. Large formations broke up. Command posts moved more often. Activity shifted to night or bad weather. Australian after-action reports documented this effect. One 4-man patrol detected a company-sized enemy force only through disturbed insects and altered bird calls. They stayed still for 6 hours. The enemy passed and later abandoned planned operations. Another patrol found a prepared ambush site they had unknowingly bypassed after changing direction earlier. Others reported enemy units withdrawing simply because signs suggested Australians might be nearby. These results did not come from better gear or larger numbers, Australian patrols were smaller and lightly supported. Their advantage came from denying the enemy reliable information. The cost was high. Extreme slowness caused physical strain. Long missions without relief demanded endurance. Absolute stillness for hours required suppressing basic human behavior. Veterans later described difficulty returning to normal life. Operational tempo was limited. Missions took longer. Resupply and extraction were harder. Success depended on discipline and leadership, yet results were consistent. Australians were engaged less often on enemy terms. When fights occurred, they started with advantage. Casualty rates reflected this. Some American commanders dismissed the difference as luck, mission choice, or avoidance of contact. Captured enemy guidance proved otherwise. The enemy made conscious decisions against Americans. They saw opportunity. Against Australians, they saw uncertainty. The Australians did not remove the enemy ability to fight. They removed his ability to predict. That difference mattered. Their approach did not rely on overwhelming force or speed. It relied on denying information. The lessons were observed, written, and shared. Individual officers recognized their value. Institutions lagged. The price of that delay was paid in casualties across hundreds of similar battles. Australians proved that adapting to environment could outperform technological superiority under certain conditions. They never claimed their methods worked everywhere, only that in the jungle they worked.